So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now, you may recognize the next voice. He is a regular on my show because he always gives a fabulous insight into the world of finance and where it's going. So, I'd like to welcome back onto the show Clive Webb. So, for those of you that haven't heard Clive's voice before, the first question is, where have you been? Because I think this is the third great report we've talked about on the show. But Clive is Head of Business Management Policy and Insights at the ACCA. So welcome back, Clive. You're an expert at this podcast business now.
I'm not sure about expert, but it's nice to be back, Hannah.
So tell us a little bit about the report and the insight you're bringing us today.
Okay. So you and I, Hannah, together, I think, with one of my former colleagues, talked about the concept of value a little while ago in one of these podcasts. And what we wanted to do was explore that in a slightly different angle. And that was the angle of, well, actually, is there a concept called the Chief Value Officer? Because there is this sense that there is something beyond the traditional CFO role. And we all know the CFO role is changing. We all know that it is moving forwards, but is it moving more into a concept like the Chief Value Officer? And is that the next step, or is that something different from where the CFO role is? And if it is different, how do the two align? So we decided to do a piece of research. In this case, we collaborated with BDO, and we drew on the insights of nearly 100 CFOs from across the world. So we had CFOs from North America, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, including the UK. So this is the distillation of their thoughts, and then trying to explore this concept of value and what it means in a world that increasingly is not just talking about financial performance, it's talking about sustainability. And we've seen the ISSB publish its statements, S1, S2, in the past couple of weeks. If you're involved in any business in Europe, CSRD is something that you will get familiar with in some form or other over the next year or two, and so on and so on.
So before I ask you to explain some of those acronyms, let's start with the concept of value. So what do we mean by value in this instance?
Okay, so if we step back, we historically have looked at the way we do business and we measure it in terms of profit. And we measure it in terms of the financial return, and we typically talk to the shareholders or those investors of finance. That's still perfectly valid. And the one thing about the concept of value is we are not saying that profit isn't the only motive. Profit is a motive, and increasingly we're talking about what an organization does in terms of its employees, its community. So where it is based, how it interacts, does it create a longer term value to that society? Is it involved in education? Is it involved in, the classic example is mining, where it's, are you restoring the landscape after you've extracted the whatever minerals you're extracting? How does it relate to its customers? Is it providing quality goods in a sustainable manner to its customers? And those concepts we've called the recipients of value, if you like, because it's how an organization does things for the benefit of those various communities. And then how do we measure that, which actually is quite a difficult concept, but how do we measure that in a way that gives validity to each of those communities? Okay, so that's the concept of the value that an organization starts to generate. And as finance teams, as CFOs, each of those regulations, each of those acronyms that I mentioned a few minutes ago, start to say, well, actually, you've got to start measuring these other things that you are giving back. So are you creating a sustainable business that is environmentally robust? is managing climate change, where we get the ISSB statement S2 from? Is it thinking about the environmental, governance and social aspects, which is where the European side, the CSRD, is coming from? And in the CSRD, there are, I think, round about 80, 87 disclosures. Don't quote me on that number, but it's a large number of things that organizations then need to disclose, not just in the financial statements, but to the same level of quality of data in how they present that information. So it's not simply just now talking about the profit and loss, it's talking about what you give back to those various recipients, if you like. And that's a concept of value. So where we had a conversation before, the concept was, well, actually, how does that work internally? Now, this is a concept of, well, actually, how does the CFO start to report that with trust and with confidence? Because this is about the financial markets as well, understanding where an organization is headed in each of those domains, and each of those stakeholders having their own, if you like, perspective or requirement.
Because it's an interesting piece, because a lot of what you said is that there is a legislative drive towards measuring value, but it's also about educating the financial markets potentially. So tell us why, from not just from a legislative perspective, we should be measuring value, but why from other perspectives?
Okay, so think about this. If you or I are a customer of a product, we want to know that that product is produced in an ethical manner. We want to know that there is no forced labor used in the production of it. And you can think about examples that we've had, particularly where garments are produced in factories where the working conditions might not be as you or I might want them to be, let's put it that way. And that has a brand and a reputational impact on us. And you can think back to, I think it was Nike, where about 10 years ago they got embroiled in a discussion about factory conditions in South Asia. That concept of value is the values that you expect the organization to have in the products and services it delivers. And it's also about what we morally think is the right state for the goods to be. The challenge for organization becomes that we don't really necessarily understand our value chains. So yes, I might have a certain good that's produced, but do I understand what the conditions are in the tier 2 suppliers or the tier 3 suppliers? And that's increasingly where the regulators are starting to come in and say, actually, you need to start understanding more and more about that. It's not just simply on financial terms. If you go to Germany again, or if you look at what the European Union is trying to do, it starts asking you, well, what are the human rights of the workforce? And that's not a one-off assessment. It's an ongoing process to understand what those rights are and how you're actually working with them. Another example, if you look at the US, round about $496 million worth of goods were impounded by US Border and Customs between the end of February and the end of May this year, because they had suspicions that there was forced labor in the supply chain. So those goods are impounded. More than likely, there is what is called a withholding order, and withholding order means that that organization cannot therefore do business, and this is not one organization, it's many, cannot import goods into the US until that's resolved or proved to the satisfaction of the US authorities that there are no forced labor activities in the supply chain or in the organization. And one of our members, there's a story on our website, explores that because she was a CFO having to deal with that issue previously. They've now got to the point where their goods are now accepted. But as she says, actually understanding the rules and regulations about forced labour, it's not like an accounting standard. It's all very much interpretive. So one good example from that, forced labour laws, the ILO guidance says that you must have access to your passport, but your passport must be securely stored. What you discover is that means each employee needs a locker, and these are people in plantations where they can individually store their passport. It's not acceptable to have one common safe. You need each. So this is about understanding a series of very different rules. It's all about brand and reputation, but it's also about, are you creating a future that is carbon neutral, etc. And these are all questions that you and I will ask as customers or employees. And we talk about Gen Z being more and more focused on the ethical side of this, and do you want to work at a company that doesn't display these things? So how do we create trust in those disclosures? How do we, as the finance community, explain where our organization is on that journey with a robustness that enables us to go, well, actually, you can trust what we say, and it's comparable to company X or company Y or company Z. So the concept of value is very broad, but very, very important.
I think one of the interesting pieces is that do you see the chief value officer as just almost like a combination of head of ESG plus CFO, or is there an extra layer to that chief value officer that you think is almost that step above in terms of what it's delivering?
I think that the first thing you need to question is, what is it that a chief value officer is doing that a CFO or leading CFO isn't doing? Okay. And I think the answer to that, and most of what our 100 would say, is that actually most of them are either well on the path or are already at the point where they're starting to report value. They're starting to think with a lens in their organization that isn't simply about financial return, it's also about all these other things as well. So the question is not, is there a new role, but is there a role that the CFO is doing that we are not explaining well enough and not articulating well enough that somebody else thinks there should be a chief value officer role? And if you, as we've done in the report, put chief value officer into ChatGPT just for a bit of fun, it will give you a view. And if you benchmark that against what a leading CFO thinks they do, you get a pretty strong correlation. If you put in chief financial officer into ChatGPT, you get chief bookkeeper, preparer of annual financial statements, head of the finance function, a very, very traditional view. And most CFOs, I would imagine, listening to this podcast will think, well, that's not what I do. So your question almost becomes, are we in reality doing this value-centric role, responsible increasingly for reporting these aspects of value, providing integrity and stewardship over them, without actually claiming the title? And some will say, and I think they're probably right, let's not rename the CFO, let's just make it clear what the CFO does in relation to value, because the CFO has that trust and integrity in a broader sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there is varying perceptions out there in the market as to what that CFO role should and does do. And I think also it depends on an organization as well as around their expectations around a CFO. And I think it's great that we're actually coming in to define what we see as that value added, that chief value officer which should, as you say, is and should be the role that a CFO plays. If they are doing that traditional bookkeeping and accounting role, then something is wrong in terms of either the ask from the business or the way that they are in that role, and the support that they have to deliver on that role. So yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you.
I was going to say that element of the role that is that financial stewardship bit, it is still fundamentally important. We're not saying, doesn't matter anymore. What we're saying is
ignore the double
it's
entry.
part of a bigger picture. Partly. But there is the assumption of that financial integrity, that ethical lens over the finance, but it's also that ethical lens needs to establish or extend to how you think about this broader concept of value. And are we able to articulate with the same degree of confidence, with the same degree of moral standing, with the same degree of ethics and confidence in data behind it, where we are going with all those other dimensions? Because that's increasingly what society wants, and capital markets want, and regulators want, because they want what we want, effectively. So you can ask me something.
Within that value officer role, what components is it made up of? Because we really are starting to broaden the reach. We talked about financial stewardship being one component. What are the rest?
Okay, so I think you can look at it in two ways, and we put two models in the report. The first is a model which sort of says, okay, so this is, if you like, the expectation side. So first and foremost, the CFO is the steward of the assets of the organization. They are not necessarily the owner of the assets, but they are the steward. They are the person responsible for the integrity and the utilization, if you like, almost of the assets. And those assets, increasingly, remember, are intangible as well as tangible. More value is derived from intangible than tangible assets in the world now. I should also say at this point that deriving value is a C-suite activity. It's not just the CFO deriving value, but the CFO is looking after the assets that help everybody else to derive value. So that's one dimension. They are strategic advisors. We talked before on this podcast about being the right hand of the CEO, and that fundamental relationship. And the couple of CEOs that we interviewed, and their first comment was, the CFO role is such a grounding for being a CEO. I couldn't understand how any CEO could do it without being a CFO. And that's about that being that strategic advisor, the ultimate business partner. They are the reporter of performance, and we've got to take performance in its broadest sense of financial, value-centric, multiple different stakeholders, both internally and externally. And if we start just running a business with that sole profit motive, it may not be a sustainable business for the future. And that's a good question. And increasingly, you're seeing conversations with private equity investors going, actually, yes, we want our own out, but we also want all these other things as well, like sustainability, carbon neutrality, etc. And they're also the guardian of risk. So in any of this journey, how do we mitigate the risks and create value? And that risk set increasingly is broader as well, because it is not just financial risk and operational risk, it's also the risk, increasing reputation to stakeholders of the varying sorts we talked about. At the heart of it, and I think this is one of the most challenging bits, and where my next piece of research goes, they are change agents or change leaders, better still, because any organization is on a change journey, whether it's driven by any of those four factors or all of those four factors. And the CFO has to be one of the people leading change in the organization and driving that sense of value and creativity and innovation. And if they're not, then there's a risk that the organization may well lag, lose competitive advantage, etc. So that's one lens.
So with that, when you spoke to those 100 CFOs, how many of them feel like they're doing all of that role?
I would actually think the vast majority, because that model is a distillation of what they said. And most of them, interestingly, put change at the very heart of all of this, because they see that change and that strategic advisor bit as how you create value for the future in organization. And value isn't simply about measuring what happens today or this year. It's about how we create something more sustainable for the future. And I think that's another thing that CFOs need to get their mind around, is the concept of value is not just about an annual cycle. It's about investing for the future. It's about something that isn't periodic. It's a longer and medium term perspective. And that's important in the sustainability piece as well. So I think most of the leading CFOs recognize what that mindset and that structure is. I think the question is, how do we help people grow to be the CFO of the future? Because that's a very different pathway from the pathway that, 20 years ago might have been the classic CFO role.
And there's a couple of things in that section I'd like to kind of pull out, but I'll just start with that interesting comment about the longevity of value, because I think that's one of the challenges I think sometimes in today's corporate age, especially when you get into the larger enterprise customers, is that it is incredibly short-term thinking sometimes in terms of decisions that are made versus that longer term value. Like, are we building a business that is going to thrive in the future versus making short-term decisions that make the shareholders happy? So what's your thoughts on that, and what was the feedback from the panel around that shift to long-term value thinking versus short-term financial thinking?
I think it's a challenge, and I think we've got quite embedded in that short-term view. And to some extent, there's nothing wrong with that short-term view, because in part it drives that economy. Oh, sorry, our economy as it exists at the moment. The challenge is, how do you balance that with creating something that is longer term sustainable, recognizing that investing for the longer term at the moment is actually quite tricky because of the cost of capital, etc., etc. So how do you make the right business decisions, I think, is going to become an important skill for the CFO. Of actually, yes, we need to be creating the short-term returns, but we cannot do that at the expense of long-term value, because if we invest or return too much in the short term, there isn't going to be a long term. And it's that dichotomy is actually quite a difficult one to navigate now. And particularly, I think, as we know, a lot of business models need to change for carbon neutrality. And the business model tomorrow is going to look and need to look different, whatever business you're in. So how do you prepare for that? How do you invest for that at the right rate at a time when interest rates, etc., are high? Is actually a very tricky decision, but it's one that probably needs a different lens of investment appraisal. This is a conversation we had when we talked about value last time, Hannah.
Yeah, it starts to open up different conversations. And I think that's the hard piece, isn't it? About I think most CFOs that I talk to understand the concept of value. I think the challenge is measuring it and communicating it well to stakeholders, and helping people understand the return on investment for, when it comes to value. I think that's the piece that everyone knows it makes sense, I think, is the challenge. It's just that, how do you get to that number and that proof of concept?
And it may not necessarily be a number, but it may be a series of facts and metrics, but it is highly contextual to each business. And that is the skill, I think, of value, is that if you're in a service industry, it's going to be different from being in a manufacturing industry, because that what you are returning looks different. But somewhere in there, you've got measures of customer satisfaction, you've got measures of greenhouse gas emissions, you've got measures of forced labour, living wage in your supply chain. There are things you can measure if you work hard enough to understand what those measures might be. But the challenge, I think, is a lot of that measurement, A, sits out the traditional financial domain, and B, relies on other parties to give you trusted information. And that sometimes is more of a challenge than we used to. One CFO described that side of things to me as single entry bookkeeping, because it doesn't have that integrity that we're all used to, but we still got to get comfortable with it, and we still got to know how to put trusted processes around it, so create, if you like, the internal control environment around it. And for a single entry bookkeeping, where we loved about double entry a moment ago, but if you think about it, it's got that inherent check and balance. In carbon emissions, you don't quite have that double entry. It's a sort of absolute number.
And so it's not just about reporting and understanding the figures, it's also about verifying and checking and adding that layer of integrity and robustness to the figures.
And it's also cycling that into your decision making. I think it's this report, or there's one on society's values, which looks specifically at the S bit. I've drawn a triangle which starts with strategy, it has reporting, and it has performance. And if you have strategy, i.e. your goal, that's linking to where the organization wants to go. If you only report it, that's where we get blue washing and greenwashing, because that's where you have a mismatch. What you need is the performance goals, the KPIs, the metrics, the things that we all love, the balanced scorecards, if you like, because that's the bit that keeps the organization moving forwards on track. That's the internal decision making. If we don't have the triangle working, then we're not going to get actionable reporting, but we'll get marketing. And that's one of the questions we get asked is, does the chief sustainability officer report to the CFO? Is it the CFO, or is it part of marketing? The answer probably is it should be nearer to the CFO role, because it is about driving performance forwards. It isn't just a sales and marketing activity, for example.
And I guess the challenge for a lot of CFOs is getting comfortable with the lack of robustness that is in the sustainability, is the ESG piece at the moment. Because there is, right? You even talk to experts on ESG, and I have, and the difference, and even they acknowledge that the lack of information and calculations and robustness around their models is a challenge to providing good information and therefore value.
And even getting the data sources to fit into those models. I was challenged the other day at a conference where I said, the amount that Bloomberg estimate we globally businesses need to invest per annum to get us to net zero is something like $7 trillion. And somebody else on the stage stood up and said it's $50 trillion. Well, there's a big gap between the two. The answer is because there are so many different ways of estimating even that number. And I just happened to go for one that was slightly less frightening. But
maybe we need a new role, which is the chief uncertainty officer.
Yeah. But that's where you come into your things like scenario modeling, sensitivity analysis, to understand, and those aren't just about financial returns. It's also about, if we are to reduce our emissions by this, what does it mean to our model? How do we need to invest? ... Or if we are to ensure that we pay the living wage in our supply chain, what does that do to our margins? What is the cost of repurposing land that we've used, or what is the cost of investing in the community, and where is the value of that? So the classic example is, would it, if you are undertaking CSR activities, do you invest $100 £100,000 or do you invest £50,000? And which is better? Well, the answer is you don't know, because you may do more with the 50 than you would with the 100. It might be you're doing the right things in the right way with the 50 to create a longer term benefit for the society around you. But we tend to measure it by I've spent 100 and 100 is good and 50 is not as good. That's the conundrum about value.
Yeah, because that's the measurable, isn't it? That is the definitive number that people can categorically stand behind. But it doesn't, as you say, the objective is not to spend the money, it's to deliver the results that we need with that money.
Yes. And that's where people are getting concerned, for example, about the metrics of CSR. It's an interesting topic, value. Yeah.
It does. And I think the challenge with value is it crosses so many aspects of a business. And even if, because there was an interesting piece that you said earlier about like the components that make up the chief value officer. And some of those components I would expect to see in a number of the C-suites roles. For instance, change management, because that, like, we absolutely need change management skills in that CFO role, but we need it across the entire organization, because business model and transformation doesn't happen in finance alone. So do you see the chief value officer from the conversation you had, do you see it as that is their role to lead it? Or are they, when you say change and, change management, do you mean within finance and within the value arena?
I think two comments on that. One, I see transformation always as organizational wide. Even finance transformation is only part of organizational transformation. Do I see the CFO being or the chief value officer being solely responsible for it? No. But are they integral to it? Absolutely. And the reason they are integral to it comes back to something that, again, most of the 100 said. The thing with the CFO role is it is the one C-suite role that interacts with all other C-suite roles on an ongoing basis. It is the connector. And if the CFO is not driving the change and helping the organization to change, and in reality, we live in a world of agile change rather than big picture change that we were 20 years ago. If we are not creating the culture of change, and the CFO is helping to drive that, and the finance community, as it is as business partners, supports that and gets it, then you've got a massive blocker, because they are the connector. They are the people that effectively network across the whole organization. And that's the pivotal role in change. So yes, they have to be the change leader, not the leader, the sole leader, but one of the leaders of change.
And so you said at the beginning of this podcast that the majority of the people that you spoke to believed they were doing the role of chief value officer. But when you go outside of the people who think they're doing it, that perception wasn't potentially the same. So where is the gap? Is it in those that are in that role and their assessment of their own delivery of that role? Or is it in a perception piece that's outside of finance, as it were, whether that's internal or external to the organization?
Can I say both? And I think that's partly the answer.
Absolutely.
I think part of it is understanding where this concept is now taking us purely away from profit being the only thing we need to report. Now, whether you are a larger entity, a smaller entity, where you sit on that continuum, whether you have US operations, European operations, you will be influenced by different sets of regulations around some of this. That doesn't matter. What does matter is thinking about the inevitability of some of this being communicated. And if you are a material supplier to somebody in Europe who is reporting under CSRD, you will probably need to disclose some information because you are in their value chain. For example, your diversity, equity, inclusion numbers, your living wage proportions, etc. And those are just examples from the social agenda. So we need to start thinking about that broader concept. And I think for a lot of CFOs, there is a journey of understanding how you collect that data, how you report that broader sense of value, and how that relates to where the organization is going. Because we're not going to get it all right in day one, are we? Yeah, that this is a new view of performance, if you like. Somebody the other day said to me, don't talk about financial, non-financial, talk about performance. Because going forward, there is only one view of performance in the accounting standards, and that is integral whether you are talking financial or sustainability. It is a view of performance.
It's interesting because just like we've talked on the podcast quite a bit actually about the need to educate your wider organization on what the numbers are saying and help them understand the numbers from a financial aspect. To me, it sounds like actually there's an even greater need for them to understand why we need to report the concept of value and performance versus core financial data.
Yeah. And if I look at the other model that we put in the report, if you look at the skill set, it's financial, it's business, so it's about the industry, it's about this concept of value, and it's about the concept of data. And how can you use the data to tell the story across the other three? And around that, yes, you've got to be a change manager, a project manager, you've got to be able to tell the story to manage stakeholders, and all around the whole of that is your ethical lens. Is this morally the trusted view? Is this the right thing to do? And that ethical framework applied is where increasingly trust in this sense of value is an important concept. Because otherwise, how do we get comparability? How do you know ethically it's the right goods you're buying?
Yeah, and trust is a big topic at the moment in terms of, especially with everything that's coming out of the woodwork, is probably the best phrase to use right now. So yeah, that in itself, I think that actually is a really good topic for another podcast, Clive. So I'm not going to dig into that right now. But let's just talk about how do we get there, right? So what are the skills that we need for a chief value officer that are different to our existing CFO role? How does it change, and how do existing CFOs need to start thinking about their development to take them forwards?
Okay, so the first thing to say, I think, as I said before, the financial piece is not open to question. That is still absolutely fundamental and important. The industry knowledge which you gain from, as one CFO said to me, the first thing I did on my first day was go out and talk to everybody in the business and understand how that business model really works. And that business acumen, industry experience, absolutely fundamental. The concept of value and how you learn about that, it's about thinking about each of those communities and then looking for the guidance. So, for example, if you're talking about the social agenda, look at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, because that tells you a lot about the principles that businesses should adopt to be ethically sound in dealing with the human rights within its supply chain. Look at the guidance around the sustainability piece, and particularly the standards S1, S2, and things like that, and understand where those are coming from. And there are education programs, ACCA provides them as well. about those. So understand that dimension, and then relate it back to what you're being asked to report, but also thinking about how that becomes part of your balanced scorecard. Because there's no point in reporting something if it isn't part of the internal management processes. And then it's having the skills, and not to be a data scientist. I'm definitely not saying that. What I'm saying is appreciate how data can help you tell the story, and think about that data in the broader sense, not just simply financial, but all the other bits of data you now need to start thinking about and collecting. And that of itself is an important bit. So there are ways to do it, but I think the other important thing is that we run the risk of not having the next generation of CFOs. So it's how do we bring the next generation forward and give them that experience, the business experience, the international experience, the operational experience, the sustainability experience that they need to be ready to step up when that CFO wants to move on. And that's actually quite a tricky development path, more so I think than historically we've had, because it isn't simply going up being the financial controller stepping up to the CFO. It's about a whole broader set of experiences that something needs to be mentored, coached through, which is an important aspect to it.
Almost feels like we need a layer between that traditional FC role and the CFO role. That we need almost like a graduation path, because that is, you're 100% right. That is a big jump from FC to CFO.
Yeah, and we need to think about how we develop those candidates, because sort of anecdotally what you hear in the marketplace is there aren't quite the candidates coming through, potentially the numbers that we need. So therefore, it's beholden on all of us and every CFO to start thinking about, well, how do I develop the next potential me? Because there is that gap between the financial controller and the CFO.
And I think it's a wider question actually about finance, because with all of the technology that's coming through, and I am, hoping to pick you and the team, the research team's brains on this on another podcast, Clive, but as we start to move away from transactional finance, we've lost that education and growing ground for the junior talents. So I think we need to, in finance, whether we're a CFO, whether an FC coaching younger individuals up, is we really need to think about where the next generation of finance talent is going to come from, because those safety roles that people have the chance to apply their knowledge and learn the core just aren't going to be there potentially in the future as technology evolves to do that piece, that piece of the work.
And dare I say it, from the reactions of some of the 100 we talked to, some of that issue is starting to materialize. Finding people in mid-level roles who, to quote one CFO, actually could explain double entry bookkeeping was a bit of a challenge.
And I think it's been a challenge that's been brewing for a while, because as finance systems have gotten more capable, people haven't had to understand double entry. So I have seen the weird look when I pulled out a T accounts when I'm going through what something is doing. So it certainly is interesting. Quite. So I probably could, again, as usual, pick your brains forever, Clive. But one last question for you. Was there anything surprising that surprised you when you came into this report? When you looked at the data, when you looked at the responses, was there anything that sort of stood out to you as being unexpected?
I think the most unexpected bit will be a rather odd answer. And that's what happens when you plug CFO into ChatGPT. Or to Bard. I should be agnostic, because we also plugged it into Bard. That's the worrying bit of this. But we can talk about, yes, leading CFOs are doing it, but if the public perception, and forgive me for using ChatGPT as a proxy, which is probably a very bad proxy, but if you have that as a proxy of what people think, then we're not articulating necessarily the value that the CFO role adds. And that was perhaps the most surprising thing, is that gap between public perception and reality. And hence why you get the conversation of, is there another role we need to invent, because we don't understand what the people currently do.
Yeah, and you don't want to confuse. Yeah, like, you know, do you invest the effort in changing the perception of the CFO role versus do you realign the role to a different title that is more felt by the organisation? Oh, food for thought. I'm sure there's a few brains
what
whirring.
CFOs do.
Yeah.
And we all know what CFOs do. The problem seems to be that nobody else does.
Yeah, and I think there is something about that need for, I think one of the things that CFOs generally aren't good at, and I know this from personal perspective, is PR. They're not very good at promoting themselves or finance within an organization. Even the most commercially and value-driven individuals I've spoken to don't quite understand how important perception, both internally and externally, is. And I find that really interesting. So again, food for thought, I think, for everyone listening to the podcast, is how we all collectively change that perception.
Agreed.
Well, thank you, Clive. As always, it's a genuine pleasure. And my brain is now thinking and pondering. You'll notice my questions have gotten slower because I'm actually processing and thinking through everything that you've given to us today. Well, you know, let's keep everyone on tenterhooks. Is there any interesting research coming up in the next 6 months that we should be keeping our eyes out and our eyes peeled for?
Yes, but we're probably doing a piece around transactional due diligence in this world. So not just simply looking at the financial lens, but where do we go in a broader lens and the practical issues. But wait and see on that one. That's a little teaser, wait and see.
Ooh, very exciting. Well, I'm sure when it comes up, we will be once again picking your brains live on the podcast. Well, thank you so much, Clive, for joining. And to our listeners, same shout out that I always have is let me know what you think. I think this topic of value is a really interesting avenue to explore. Where are the areas that you feel like you need a deeper dive into? Would love to hear from our listeners, and what questions should I have asked? I only get 45 minutes or so to ask questions, so what did I miss? What do we need to pick Clive's brain on next time? So thank you, Clive. Thank you for joining me once again. It's been amazing having you back on the show.
Pleasure, anytime.